Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Humanities Forum of this spring semester. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here at PC and the director of the Providence College Humanities Forum. We've got a fantastic lineup of events this spring. I hope to see many of you back again here on Friday afternoons in the weeks ahead. The Humanities Forum is an initiative of the Development of Western Civilization program, and its primary purpose is to provide a regular space most weeks during the semester where the campus community can come together to deepen our understanding of and appreciation for the humanities, welcome a diverse range of guests from on and off campus, and participate in a genuinely shared intellectual life together. Because of this, each of our events conclude with a relaxed reception, and I hope that many of you will join us in the great room just down the hall after this afternoon's presentation to continue our conversation. Today, the Forum, in collaboration with the Department of History and Classics, is very happy to be hosting the Reverend Cornelius P. Forster, OP, Making History Lecture Series, which is sponsored by the Gladys Brooks Foundation. Our guest is Professor Donald Prudlo, Associate Professor of Ancient and Medieval History at Jacksonville State University. Dr. Prudlo earned his BA in History with, I'm sure our History and Classics colleagues will be happy to know, a minor in Classics from Christendom College, his MA in Theological Studies from the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College, and his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Virginia. He has been a professor at Jacksonville State University since 2005 and has been a Richard Weaver Fellow, a Lehrman Center Fellow, and an Earhart Fellow. An expert in medieval religious history and medieval Italy, Professor Prudlo is a recognized scholar in hagiography and saints' lives, medieval miracle stories, church history, and the development of canonization. The author of 3 books, numerous articles, he has an additional 5 books forthcoming in the near future, including the Brill Companion to the Inquisition and To Light the World Ablaze, the history of the friars preachers to 1323. This afternoon he will be speaking on Dominican saints and the new Mendicant spirit in the 13th century, and please join me in welcoming Professor Prudlo.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate it. Well, my credentials get so padded that I can probably get a job as a football coach at Notre Dame, I think, now. You can tell that this is a Catholic school by how far back everybody sits, right? That's the first thing that you can tell. But thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've met so many wonderful people. And I want to talk particularly today about the radical foundations of the early Dominican order. And thank you so much to my very good friend, Dr. Raymond Hain. I call him Ray. Apparently everybody here calls him Raymond, but I knew him when he was a freshman in college. So I am excited to be here for Providence's centennial year. But most of all, I'm thrilled to be present while the Jubilee of the Friars Preachers is celebrated. The Jubilee, which will actually close tomorrow. And it brings to mind a quote by one of my favorite philosophers: when 800 years old you reach, look as good you will not. I had wanted to wear something in a Dominican vein, but when I was at Santa Sabina last May, they didn't have any commemorative lay clothing. So I tried to do a search for Dominican on the web, and it wasn't quite what I expected. I like what I found, though, and I bought a bunch of it. So that was, but came up short. Though, in light of that, and I know this won't be popular here, but because I'm a Marquette fan. I know they're rivals in your conference. And so since I couldn't find any Dominican stuff, I came dressed in a Jesuit habit. But in any case, I think that the subject of this lecture is topical both for the order and for your college. I want to explore the influences and contexts that surrounded the foundation of one of the most astonishing orders in the history of the church. Now I can hear my friend Father Brian Milady from the Western Province saying, "Oh goodness, another lecture by the laity." However, I hope you accept this lecture in gratitude for all that the order has done for the church. Now, the creation of the order was secured by the bull of Honorius III, Gratiarum Omnium Largitori, which was promulgated exactly 800 years ago tomorrow. And so today I want to investigate what made this foundation truly radical. Now, unfortunately, the historian is confronted with a great mass of material that later grew out of devotion and justifiable pride, and he or she must endeavor to place events and characters in context, try and peer back in order to reconstruct an image that, when shorn of these accretions, gives even more testimony to the vision of the founders. For instance, as a medievalist, I don't have anything to say about the rosary. What later in the 15th and 16th centuries became so central to the order's identity was simply not present in the first 200 years. But seeing past this venerable tradition gives us new advantages. It enables us to see the genuine and deep Marian devotion of the early Dominicans as it actually was. For instance, in their veneration of the Salve Regina, their insistence that the form of the habit came from a vision of Mary, and the fact that one of the central mottos of the order, Laudare, Benedicere, Predicare, is taken from the liturgical preface of the Feast of the Blessed Virgin. Now, of course, one immediately turns to the figure of St. Dominic in the quest to find out about the purposes and aims of the order. Unfortunately, a popularizing vision of the founder too often becomes redolent of the ancient myth of Athena. Innocent III struck Diego of Osma on the head with an axe, and out sprung Dominic, fully grown and in the habit and in possession of a general preaching license. The reality is far more complex and far more interesting. I propose here to do what Father Augustine Thompson has done for St. Francis, a figure of far more fantastical and polemical interpretations than Dominic. Of course, we have had to wait for the best biography of Francis to be done by a Dominican, but of course that should not surprise us. Dominic, when compared with the florid Francis, is a difficult figure to approach. He was significantly more reserved, private, and intellectual than Francis. Indeed, one of his 20th century biographers has described him, quote, as one of the most unresponsive of historical figures. And this has some grain of truth. Dominic is also burdened by the fact that he had a passion for that most outdated and out-of-fashion concept called truth, particularly as it affected the eternal destiny of men and women. Conversely, Francis was a preacher of love. He, particularly a concept to modernity so hazy that it can co-opt Francis for pretty much anything that it wants to. But these are gross generalizations, and these are unfair to both of the saints. Dominic spoke the truth because he loved, and Francis loved because it was rooted in truth. In a real sense, because they were saints, they represented two sides of the same Christian coin. Love and truth can never be separated, particularly in Christianity, since they are both attributes of divinity itself. So then, Dominic, too, must be rooted in his context, in his influences, and in his contemporary situation. But even before that, we must turn our eyes to the sources that inspired the founder. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Christ himself is the author of the quest for perfection. Am I going back far enough for you? Historians are really annoying like that. We're never content to begin at the beginning. My colleague was once asked what the origin of World War I was. He started his answer with the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. But in any case, perfection in the Christian tradition consisted in conformity to the exemplar, Christ, who was poor, who lived his life in perfect obedience to the Father, and, Pace Dan Brown, lived a life of celibacy. These three counsels came to be discerned by the early church as the key components of a more perfect way of seeking sanctity. This seeking for perfection elided well with tendencies in the Greco-Roman world. From the dawn of Greek culture, people had pursued arete, or excellence, in various fields, until Socrates had summed it all up with the question, how can I be an excellent human being? He bequeathed this question to his students and to later generations. Now Christianity had an incarnate example of an excellent human, the icon of perfection itself, the image of the invisible God. Arete had taken on flesh. Now such excellence was not to be limited to a Stoic elite, but because of the outpouring of grace was open to all, Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. Christianity, in a certain sense, was a transformation and democratization of excellence. Now the elite would not be leisured philosophers, with my apologies to all my philosophical colleagues, but the elect of grace and predilection, those who interpose no barriers to the working of God in their lives. Of course, we do know this does not necessarily exclude leisured philosophers. But there is a certain truth in Nietzsche's famous dictum that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. Yet even given that pattern, there's tensions in the Christian understanding of the proper path for holiness. Should we imitate Christ in the desert, or should we imitate Christ in the streets and in the villages? A particular purchase came to be placed on the example of Mary and Martha. Christ comes to his friend's home for hospitality and rest. Martha, the dutiful woman of the house, reminds me of the mother in A Christmas Story. My mother had not had a hot meal for herself in 15 years. and I'm sure you've had similar experiences. Such conscientious service finds its prototype in the put upon Martha, who busies herself taking care of Jesus and his not inconsiderable entourage. She does not complain except when her lazy sister Mary decides not to help and simply sit and listen to Jesus preach. In a saying which has echoed down the ages, Christ gently remonstrates with Martha. Mary has chosen the better part. It shall not be taken from her. Again, we see an elision with classical thought, which always considered the life of leisured contemplation superior to the life of action. Christianity changes the focus of contemplation, however, from abstract theorizing to a person. It is far easier to contemplate the beloved than the idea of love. It became the classical proof text for the superiority of the contemplative life in Christianity. Thomas will have to handle this dexterously in the Secunda Secundae, whereby he affirms the traditional position of the superiority of the contemplative life, but then smoothly transitions to the idea that Dominicans occupy the highest place, for the fullness of contemplation is to bring its fruits to others. During the first 3 centuries of intermittent persecution, there was little time to meditate on such ideas. The path to holiness was crystal clear. Martyrdom was the supreme witness. Yet something else was stirring. As Christians increased in number, and particularly after the legalization, martyrdom was no longer an easy possibility. Yet Christians had not ceased to seek the life of perfection. For this reason, men and women streamed out into the deserts of Egypt, and from there spread throughout Christendom. It was a type of living martyrdom. Yet a funny thing happened on the way to the desert. The new monks found that the more that they abandoned the city, the more the city streamed out to find them. Even the most contemplative monks found themselves inundated by requests for prayers and advice and by offerings from the pious faithful. Nothing could prevent the Christian people from being attracted to their holiness and patronage. In a very real sense, then, even the lives of those most dedicated to contemplation were never holy without action. Yet what of all those left in the cities? As the Roman Empire became increasingly Christian, who would be left to minister to these? Much of this responsibility fell to the bishops, but how could they prevent contaminations? By all the manifold temptations described in detail by St. Augustine in Carthage. As in so many instances, he himself provided the answer. Attracted by monasticism, but prevented from withdrawal from the world, he proposed a novel form of religious life. He would create a quasi-monastery centered around the episcopal liturgy of the cathedral. His priests would go out every day to attend to the needs of the faithful, to minister to them. But then each night they would reconvene for the common life of table and cloister. They would spiritually recharge for their active missions during the day. Augustine had pioneered a form of life that would later go by the name of canons. They would be urban monks, an elite and unified spiritual force. Augustine's rule was never as formal as those written by St. Basil or St. Benedict, but for that reason it became a useful tool for those seeking a more flexible approach to the religious life. Indeed, Dominic was raised up in this tradition, having been an Augustinian canon before his foundation of the order, so it was natural that he would gravitate to this malleable rule for his new religious community. However, most of the West coalesced around the Benedictine regula. And several significant aspects of this form of life would have a permanent effect on the friars' preachers. Benedict, contrary to rigid Eastern rules that demanded near constant prayer, instead saw the humane necessity of balancing work and worship. For many in the monasteries in the twilight of Roman order, this work became fixated on the preservation and study of the texts of antiquity. Their careful preservation of these texts and their dedication to study ensured that the history of the Western world does not begin in 800 AD. They demonstrated that work could be understood in intellectual terms. Over the course of centuries, however, the initial purity of Benedictine observance began to wane. And as is common in the history of religious orders, there was a cycle of decay and recovery. The most important of these, for our purposes, was the Reformation of Cluny. Cluny restored the centrality of the divine liturgy in the religious life, as well as the common observances that had fallen into abeyance. Yet it was the constitutional innovations at Cluny that would have the most far-reaching effects. Benedict had designed his monasteries to be autonomous communities under the sole and absolute rule of the abbot. This meant that each monastery was completely independent. Cluny recognized that this opened up the possibility for unwarranted innovations and corruptions to the intentions of Benedict. Each Cluniac monastery would be ruled not by an abbot, but rather by a prior. Once a year, the prior would have to attend a chapter general at the home abbey of Cluny, where he would give a report to his house, to the leader of Cluny, who became a sort of super abbot. And I found a picture of a super abbot. This ensured the uniformity and observance of the Cluniacs and brought a measure of accountability that was lacking in the original plan of Benedict. Cluny had proven exceptionally popular. Monastery after monastery began to affiliate themselves with the reform. It obtained permission from the papacy that any monk might leave a relaxed monastery and join a Cluniac one. This emptied the bad monasteries of good men and led to the eventual extinction of many relaxed houses, while bringing renewed strength to the reform. What Cluny had done was essentially found the first religious order that had a clear constitutional framework of governance and oversight. It would prove to be an enduring and popular model in the church, one that the Dominicans would adopt, including the tradition of annual chapters general. In addition, Cluny acquired another privilege that was going to be critical to the development of later groups. They acquired the privilege of exemption from any authorities other than the Pope. No interference, either secular or ecclesiastical, could be given to them. This proved to be one of the marvelous symbioses of church history. Cluny achieved liberty of movement and operation, as well as a powerful, and one might say remote, overseer. The Pope, meanwhile, was able to increase his prestige by putting his authority behind what was seen as a genuinely evangelical reform, and was able to enhance his power by having an elite group of men subject only to him, reaching to the corners of Christendom, bringing Roman law, liturgy, and claims. It would be this same symbiotic relationship which would propel the Mendicants to such success in the 13th century. But Cluny, too, for all of its dynamism, went the way of many religious movements in the history of the church and began to lose steam. While it never actively became corrupt, it did become comfortable. Cluny wasn't equipped to handle the new situations brought about by the energies released by the Gregorian reform of the 11th century. New types of religious life began to spring up. A particular energy was given to the observance of the Benedictine rule by the life and teaching of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, like his predecessors in the Gregorian reform, and by reflecting the tenor of the church in general, was attracted to purity, simplicity, and poverty. Like most of the great religious reformers, he embedded the needs of the age within the perennial practices of the church. As the animating spirit of the new order called Citeaux, the Cistercians, he implemented alterations which would cast a long shadow on later religious developments. They were the first to establish a canonical novitiate for the probation of candidates to the order, something which aided stability and promoted formation. They pioneered the use of lay brothers, who would attend to the material needs of the convent, which left the monks free for prayer and ministry. While they copied the Cluniac method of chapters general, they also allowed each monastery to elect their own abbots. Though answerable to the chapter general, they had full freedom of governance in their own houses. This would presage the marvelous and delicate balance of authority and democracy that was to be a hallmark of the friars' preachers. Finally, the Cistercians, in their devotion to poverty, refused the normal course of income offered by the medieval church, recourse to regular tithes. They preferred rather to live on the production of their own houses, including the production of intoxicating beverages. This was part of the evangelical drive to greater poverty. Though they still did not profess the corporate poverty which would characterize the mendicants, the stricture prevented reliance on external and stable sources of income. Bernard's order had innovated in continuity to such an extent that I am tempted by the conclusion that the mendicants were merely unmoored Cistercians. Yet Bernard's innovations all came in line with the broad tradition of the church, always attempting to more purely come to terms with the search for perfection called for by her founder. Yet outside the walls of the cloister, a new appetite was growing for holiness. The old spiritual division of labor between religious and lay was giving way. This was partly a result of the Gregorian reforms, but also because of the rapid increase in population and wealth in Europe. A desire for holiness and purity, coupled with feelings of guilt about material wealth, began to generate new movements of spirituality. People began to seek out novel ways of fulfilling the evangelical mandate. They began to reflect that perhaps the cloistered monastic life was not the only way to fulfill the injunctions of perfection. To that end, they began to consider how best to live the life that Christ intended, which seemed almost as concerned with the life of Martha as with that of Mary. While the ideal of the imitation of Christ was still centuries away, medievals began to reflect on the life of Christ's followers, the apostles. These had not gone to monasteries and hidden themselves away in a death to the world. Rather, they had become itinerant preachers of the gospel, traveling from town to town. They did this without income or sometimes knowing where their next meal would come from. Men such as Robert of Arbrissel and Bernard of Tiron were among the first to embrace such a vision. People had not experienced this before. To have a committed and passionate preacher living an external life of penance and poverty, brimming with a powerful message and charismatic delivery, contrasted sharply with their own experiences of fixed parish priests, sometimes uneducated, and in many cases preaching only infrequently. It was not that most of the clergy of this time were actively corrupt, for the Gregorian reform had turned the tide in that direction. It was just that men like Robert were extraordinary. These wandering preachers led a life of travel, excitement, and dedication to the Word of God. And because of that, they prospered. Yet all was not well. Had not Benedict himself warned of gyrovagues, monks who wandered from place to place without stability? Did not 2 Timothy caution against unauthorized preachers? But even beyond this negative tradition, there were further problems. These wandering preachers were theologically illiterate. In a complex religion like Catholicism, it's easy to slip into heresy. As long as they preached penance, it might be okay, but how difficult it was to limit oneself to this and to avoid theology. Further, Romans 10 was clear. How can they preach unless they be sent? These preachers were not authorized. They had no canonical mission. Formal preaching is restricted to the ordained in the Christian tradition. To make matters worse, the bishops, who were the actual successors of the apostles, saw these men as interlopers who claimed to be living the apostolic life. Such was a recipe for serious conflict. Now, some itinerants managed to mainstream themselves within existing church structures. Notable among them was St. Norbert of Xanten. The order that he founded, that of the Premonstratensians, was of prime importance for the development of the friars' preachers. Norbert had adopted a canonical lifestyle, adapted from the rule of St. Augustine, which was dedicated not to retreat from the world, so valued by the monastic tradition, but rather one which could engage in active urban ministry. After his foundation of a permanent religious congregation, the canonical life was the closest thing that Norbert could find to have an active public ministry in the context of a community of perfection. It is the genius of the Norbertines that they were the first order in the history of the church to combine the active life of canons with the contemplative life of monks. This meant that they lived in a community, but that they carried their piety and contemplation with them out into the world of the laity. Norbert's movement thrived because of this symbiosis with lay society. They brought the world of the monastery with its devotion and liturgy into the towns of medieval Europe. While the Norbertines were not specifically dedicated to preaching, the laity, newly hungry for a higher level of spirituality, responded to their example with enthusiasm. Norbert crafted a constitution that was flexible, the first attempt to balance the active and contemplative lives in an orthodox manner. For the health of the church, a meeting of the two was necessary. The cloister was the necessary precondition for the life of perfection, but the streets and parishes were the necessary avenue for those with a zeal for souls. In terms of his constitution, Norbert retained the legislative general chapter, but he made the abbot general subject to it. This foreshadowed the position of master general as would later operate in the Dominican order, both in terms of its ordinary authority, but added to it his accountability before the chapter. Indeed, it is a fact mentioned with no hesitation by the early Dominicans themselves how much they owed to the Premonstratensian constitutions. Now, not all stories had such a happy ending as the success of the Norbertines. A second movement had its origins in the 1160s, and this is also critical for understanding the friars' preachers. This group was founded by Peter Waldo at Lyon. Peter had been converted to a life of apostolic poverty. He began to preach simplicity and started to attract followers. Such an occurrence was not unusual by that time. For nearly 100 years, groups of varying shades of orthodoxy had come and gone throughout Christendom. In 1179, the small group went to Rome to present themselves before Pope Alexander III. While there may have been some initial attraction to their attitudes of poverty, the satirical curialist Walter Map quickly exposed the group as theologically illiterate in what was to become a classic case of a Pyrrhic victory. They were forbidden to preach doctrine, for they had no training. Only the bishop or those authorized by him because of their theological education, could bear the title preacher. A distinction was made, though, between preaching doctrine and preaching repentance. Anyone could do the latter. It was considered the cardinal duty of any Christian. The poor of Lyon, or Waldensians as they came to be called, either did not accept these distinctions in Christian preaching, or they found it too difficult to preach penance without bringing doctrine into it, and so continued after their accustomed manner. This resulted in their eventual excommunication. As happened with many movements in the 1100s, active opposition from the institutional church drove the Waldensians from their itinerant preaching of repentance towards doctrinal heresy. Yet at the same time, the Waldensians evinced a genuine religious sentiment which the church would have to confront. The year 1200 was in many ways a new dawn for the Western Church. Thoroughly reformed by the Gregorians, the papacy had confirmed its leadership role in Christendom. The elaboration of canon law and the streamlining of church bureaucracy meant, in a very real sense, that all medieval roads led to Rome. This progress culminated with the election of the 37-year-old Lothario Conti as Pope Innocent III in 1198. You can buy an Innocent III action figure. It comes with super interdict kung fu grip, I think. It also comes with a rather rude Latin saying on the scroll. You can ask me about it later. But he was a vigorous young man with a decisive mind. He molded the papacy by building upon the success of his predecessors, becoming perhaps the most powerful pontiff in history. Armed with this authority, Innocent intended a wholesale reclamation of Europe for the Christian faith. The two chief problems he encountered were the poor condition of the laity in terms of education and the rise of movements that skirted the edge of orthodoxy. By purifying the church and elevating the spiritual life of its members, Innocent was convinced the problem of heresy would go away. While he legislated wisely in terms of the reformation of Christian society, he was perplexed. Not only did heresy not go away, it seemed to be strengthening. In addition to legislation and governance, there would have to be a revolution in holiness. Innocent did what he could, deploying saints as the vanguards of the spiritual force against heresy. He worked to reconcile heretical groups that were amenable to reaffiliation. He made moral purification of the clergy a priority of his pontificate, but he could not do it all himself. What he needed was an elite cadre of men dedicated to both the doctrine of the church and the observation of the precepts and counsels of the gospel. Innocent understood the importance of sending out preachers and commissioned several legates personally to oversee a preaching mission in the territory most affected by heretical tendencies, Provence, today in southern France. They were to conduct a general preaching campaign in order to explain Catholicism and refute the heretics. Their mission, however, was fruitless. Dualist Cathar sentiment had seeped into the populace and the civil authorities themselves. If they were not always directly implicated, they were certainly sympathetic to heresy. Innocent had wanted them to attract a band of preachers, but in this they also failed. In essence, then, the Pope had provided them the tools that they would need, but the legates, though they were certainly not bad men, lacked the creativity to fulfill the task. In essence, then, the predicatio, or the preaching that Dominic would later lead, was the conception of Innocent III, part of his multi-pronged strategy for church reform. Meanwhile, further to the south, over the Pyrenees Mountains, other aspects of Innocent's policy of reform were bearing fruit. In the Diocese of Osma, Bishop Diego de Acebo had been busy reforming his local church, making sure the clergy were well educated, and ensuring competent men were in authority in his own cathedral chapter. Diego himself was a learned man, but he knew that learning had to be allied with virtue. The church at Osma was a microcosm of what Innocent wanted the universal church to be. While he was a model prelate and a saintly man, Diego had a wanderlust that tended to draw him away from his local church. He had a deep desire for evangelization and tended to be attracted to whatever apostolic project was near at hand. In 1203, the King of Castile sent Diego to Denmark to arrange a marriage for his son. The young sub-prior of the Augustinian chapter traveled with him, named Dominic of Caleruega. As they traveled north over the mountains, they stopped at an inn near Toulouse. There they encountered heresy for the first time. Diego seems to have instilled into Dominic his love for evangelization. Dominic was moved to pity by finding some people infected with heresy. In the modern world, we have to struggle somewhat to understand Dominic's pity. He believed with all his heart that the willful embrace of heresy by a former Catholic guaranteed that one would spend eternity in hell, deprived of both God and happiness. So animated was he by this conviction that he dedicated his life to making sure that heretics had every possibility to repent of their errors, and to make sure that they did not endanger the salvation of anyone else. If one does not understand this motivation, whether or not one sympathizes with it, it will be utterly impossible to understand the further unfolding of this history. It was not power that motivated the first friars, but love and zeal. Even though some might certainly corrupt that ideal, it remained the foundational grounding of the whole of their mission. However, Diego quickly turned to other matters. He had become transfixed by another new idea, the last remaining pagan frontiers of Christendom. Now he wanted to go to the Baltics. These were being slowly Christianized, and the idea of serving as a missionary to real pagans began to occupy Diego's mind, though in reading his life, one wonders how fixed the attention of Diego ever actually was. Instead of returning directly to Castile, Diego and Dominic headed south over the Alps to Rome. There they met Innocent III face to face. The bishop asked that he might be able to resign his diocese and become a missionary. Innocent prudently refused. Diego was just the kind of bishop he was looking for, moral, committed, and competent, though it seems that he had some sort of medieval ADD. The Pope in no way wanted to lose him from his diocese, and so refused him permission. Diego, however, did not miss a beat. Instead of taking ship or the direct coastal road, he made another detour, this time to Burgundy, where he remained for some time at Citeaux, the mother house of the Cistercians. He did this ostensibly to obtain new monks for a foundation and to acquire manuscripts, but one suspects that Diego had become fixated on another new idea. He himself was clothed in the Cistercian habit. Diego then, after running out of excuses, reluctantly returned home. But looking for a new adventure, he and Dominic encountered the three disheartened papal legates in 1206. These had achieved little to nothing in their years of effort. The preaching was of no use, since the heretics constantly mocked them about the condition of the local clergy, which was certainly complacent, comfortable, and ignorant. They were prepared to tender their resignations to the Pope. Then came Diego, alive with his visions of evangelization. He began to work on the legates. The first thing he did was to attempt to understand the rationale of the heretics. This in itself was a startling innovation. The legates had proceeded from the opposite assumption that Catholicism was right, and so it made little difference to understand the teachings of the heretics. Diego said if one was to fight heresy, maybe one better learn about heresy first. And there was a further, enduring breakthrough, though it's not exactly clear how it happened. The conventional Dominican account was that the legates sought Diego's advice as a matter of courtesy as he passed through. But many historians today consider more likely the later tale told by the Dominican preacher and inquisitor Stephen of Bourbon, some 2 generations later. He claims that Diego, on his own, started a debate with heretics and was defeated. They claimed for themselves the mantle of apostolicity, and pointing out that Diego, despite his Cistercian pretensions, traveled with a large group that did honor to him as a bishop. Stephen reports that, chagrined by this, Diego took another of his drastic steps. He dismissed his whole train in order to conform himself to the type of a wandering, mendicant preacher. He took with him only Dominic as his companion. Here was a genuine shift. It wasn't itinerant preaching that was new. The real change was that a bishop was doing it, divesting himself of the privileges of rank in a zeal for souls. He and Dominic began to traipse the back roads of Languedoc, begging their meals from house to house. 2 consequences of this are immediately apparent. First, Diego was now fighting fire with fire, backing his doctrine with pious acts, refusing to cede the title of apostle to the heretics. Second, not only was mendicancy looked down upon by the institutional church, it was thoroughly scandalous in the eyes of Innocent III. It would take some time before this idea of institutionalized mendicancy trickled up, as it were. It was to Innocent's credit that he finally began to see its value near the end of his life. It was this innovation that was seen as the true turning point by the later Dominicans. Stephen of Bourbon will say, quote, "This was the cause for the instituting of our order. I heard this from the first brethren who were in that territory with Blessed Dominic." Having established a beachhead of sorts with the establishment of the female monastery of Pruy, Diego finally, after 10 years, felt compelled to return to his see. While it is certainly true that the running of his diocese had been left in good hands, he had thoroughly reformed it, his wanderlust had deprived his people of his leadership for a long period. He decided to return home, but Jordan of Saxony, the second master general, gives us a short, tantalizing might have been. Diego certainly wished to return and take care of his diocese. It was what the Pope had commanded in any case. But Diego was primed for what would have been a whirlwind visit. He took time to appoint Dominic spiritual superior of the preaching, and then hurried to Spain to acquire more funds for Pruy. When this was accomplished, he intended to return to Languedoc and seek the Pope's approval to ordain preachers to continue the mission. Clearly, it was his intention to head the effort himself, perhaps intending to use Prudlo as a sort of base for preachers from which they could undertake short mendicant missions to outlying territories. One is forced to ask if Diego had it in mind to form a religious congregation 10 years before the formal approval of the friars' preachers. He perhaps left this blueprint with Dominic. Whether or not it is the case, it remains that Diego's part in the foundation of the friars has been underappreciated. Dominic, a capable and loyal follower, received much of what he was later to streamline into the friars' preachers from the initial foresight, innovativeness, and intrepidity of Diego of Osma. And so now we finally pass to St. Dominic himself. I know, now I'm 40 minutes in, I finally get to St. Dominic. He had the persistence and perseverance that Diego's character lacked. It was he and he alone who kept the predicatio going for nearly a decade, between the death of Diego and the dispersion of the legates, through the trying times of the Albigensian Crusade and until the first gathering of followers in the early 1210s. Brother Dominic, as he called himself, was absolutely unwavering, knowing that a steady hand would be needed once the storm of the crusade had passed. Dominic had exceptionally close relations with the bishops and prelates of the area. He was friends with many Cistercian abbots, on excellent terms with the papal legates, and a close associate of several bishops, among them his very close friend and associate Fulk of Toulouse. He obtained licenses from them, worked as their vicar, or served as their traveling companion on many occasions. In other words, Dominic knew how to use the system. These prelates saw the good work that he was doing and valued the freedom that his somewhat anomalous canonical position gave him to achieve real good in the area. So they tried to aid him, to provide sources of revenue and official support where they could. During this period, Dominic was slowly gathering a small group around him who would serve as fellow preachers and ministers. Now, at the head of a modest band and responsible for the pastoral and temporal care of Prudlo, Dominic needed to make administrative decisions which would ensure the stability and success of the mission. By the year 1214, Dominic had begun to contemplate the development of some sort of stable religious organization that would build upon the success that he demonstrated was possible. Being somewhat secure in temporalities and happily burdened with a growing body of followers, he probably turned to his close friend, Fulk of Toulouse, to act as a proctor for him in setting up this apostolic way of life. Dominic traveled to Toulouse and placed the matter in his friend's very capable hands. Of course, Fulk offered remarkable material contributions, but something further was needed. While in Toulouse, ministering to the converted heretics in the city, one Peter Celia professed himself in Dominic's hands. As was common practice at the time, Peter decided to deed to Dominic all of his considerable property. Here was a serendipitous opportunity. Dominic, moving into the houses, took the occasion formally to profess Peter and one brother Thomas as members of the new order. Dominic now had a residence and a community. From the very beginning, it was clear that they were to be a clerical order, with all of the obligations of the divine office and community life that implied. By August of 1215, they had acquired the use of the Church of St. Romanus. Fulk himself saw the great utility of the preaching, especially when led by the holy and charismatic Dominic. Seeing the swift establishment of the order in the heart of his city, he was more than happy to commission them as a stable group of religious men in June of 1215. Quote, "We, Fulk, institute Brother Dominic and his associates as preachers in our diocese for the purpose of stamping out the perversion of heresy, uprooting vice, teaching the rule of faith, and instructing the people in sound morals. They propose to travel on foot and to preach the word of the gospel in evangelical poverty as religious." End quote. Fulk presciently delegated his own episcopal authority as preachers to Dominic and his followers as a community rather than as individuals. In addition, we have one of the first instances of a devotion to religious poverty on a community level. Fulk, too, was axial in the order's foundation. Fulk and Dominic then proceeded to the next step, which was approval by Rome. The Pope responded favorably to the petition after the Lateran Council, with the sole stipulation that Dominic and his group adopt a pre-existing rule for religious life. If they did this, papal confirmation would immediately follow. His revenues were confirmed, and Dominic could be relaxed in the fact that Prudlo was taken under the special protection of the papacy. While formally, some had contended that Dominic had a radical plan for a mobile order freed of any monastic duties, there is no actual evidence to support such a conclusion. Dominic, a canon by training, had lived the regular, stable, and clerical religious life with his confreres before the council and continued it long afterward without comment. Dominic naturally tended toward this form of life as a bastion of study, prayer, and contemplation, from which sallies could be made against the heretics for the proper care of souls. There does not seem to be any indication that he favored the sort of unstable itinerancy or radical mendicancy of some of the 12th century preachers. Dominic was far too pragmatic and attached to the church for that. In fact, more recent scholarship has suggested that Dominic and Fulk came with a modest proposal to ensure the continuation of the predicatio in the Diocese of Toulouse, and that it was Innocent III who suggested that the project be more ambitious. When he returned to his brethren in early 1216, their main task was to select a rule from those then existing in the church, the main requirement for papal approval. While there were wide diversity, to choose from the selection was almost natural, the rule of St. Augustine. While it may have seemed that this forced coercion into a pre-existing rule could be constraining to the religious creativity of the period, in actuality, Augustine's precepts provided the strong community and ecclesiastical framework necessary for the vision of the flowering of perpetual preachers against the heretics. From the very beginning, writers noted how useful the selection of this rule had been for the order. Its chief advantage was its vague nature. It could be adapted to any number of different religious charisms. Jordan of Saxony himself notes how the first chapter general made modifications enforcing stricter behavior than the rule demanded in matters of food and clothing. For all of that flexibility, the rule implied several things. It made Dominicans a corporate body of clerics with community life, recitation of the divine office in common, and residential attachment to churches. In adopting this manner of life, the Brothers of Toulouse had avoided two extremes, which would have made future development particularly problematic. On one hand, their full acceptance of the clerical life made them unequivocally identifiable within the institutional hierarchy of the church. They had a canonical place which protected them from charges made against previous itinerant preachers, particularly those who had opposed the church and fallen into heresy. Because of their profession and ordination, their critics could not say that they did not have a title to preach or to administer the sacraments per se. From the beginning, the men of the preaching would be in and from the heart of the church, ex corde ecclesiae. Conversely, the adoption of a canonical rule meant that the brothers of the preaching avoided becoming monks in the classical sense. The brethren, with no disrespect to the older monastic orders, well, maybe a little disrespect, had seen how this stability hampered evangelization. The Dominicans eschewed this local stability in favor of a mere canonical attachment to a local church, which could be transferred to another should the need arise. In this way, they avoided becoming the dreaded gyrovagues, or unattached monks condemned by St. Benedict, but maintained the ability to move and deploy as the need arose. The Dominican order is anchored deeply in the history and tradition of the church, while also being a product of contemporary developments, aided by the brilliance of some of the foundational figures like Innocent III, Diego, and Bishop Fulk. Indeed, up to now, it is fair to say that Dominic's own contributions were muted and somewhat derivative, notwithstanding his personality, holiness, and drive. Yet finally here, one can see the full flowering and maturation of Dominic's creativity and genius. It is here, in the constitutions of the order, that the full measure of the originality of the founder unfolds. Dominic, it is true, stands on the shoulders of giants, but because of that, what he sees is astonishing. The constitutions of the Dominican order are administrative, canonical, and religious breakthrough of the first order. To begin with, Dominic shows a creativity in omitting or augmenting passages from the constitutions of Prémontré as he considers necessary. For example, he discards all the Norbertine insistence on manual labor, as inherited from the whole of the Benedictine tradition. No order up to this time had dispensed with manual labor. Even the primitive Franciscan rule assumes its necessity. Manual labor was to be dispensed with by the new order in favor of its overriding mission of study. Their labor would be to study, which would take on the dual function of personal sanctification and the care of souls at the same time. Dominic enjoined silence as a fundamental practice, far beyond the prescriptions of Prémontré. Silence would be of immense benefit to every aspect of Dominican life: study, preaching, lecturing, and prayer. Everything again becomes subordinated to the order's main task of saving souls. Yet at the same time, Dominic kept intact the sections on liturgy and the divine office. There is no indication that Dominic sought a lessening of community obligations. All those present in the house were obliged to celebrate the canonical hours. They were to observe the same rules at meals as did Prémontré. Dominic knew that both the life of prayer and community spirit had to be maintained. The danger in such a fraternity dedicated to study and preaching was that of a rising individualism, and these customaries sought to check that tendency. Two issues of fundamental importance were added to the constitutions, which came to be recognized as distinctively Dominican. The first was the issue of dispensation. Dominic grants direct and broad powers to religious superiors to dispense their subjects from the rule when the needs of the apostolate demand it. This rule for Dominic, the rule for Dominic is not the end, but rather the means to achieve the ends of the order. This broad dispensational authority granted wide latitude to Dominican superiors to allow their subordinates to participate in their apostolates more freely. It was a living authority, bound certainly within custom and reason, but one which was adaptable to the most diverse situations that could arise. Most of the duties of the brothers in the monastery could be dispensed in favor of study. These included meals, the chapter of faults, and even the choral office. This dispensational authority anticipated what was certainly the spirit of the law, later codified in 1236, that the rule only bound under pain of penalty, not under pain of sin. Formally, disobedience to a religious rule involved personal sin on the part of the subject. In matters not involving the moral order, that is, the rules imposed by the Dominican constitutions, violation did not mean sin, though a friar was still bound to do the penances prescribed by the law and the will of the superior. This was a freedom not enjoyed by the older orders, and enabled the brethren to go about their business with a clearer conscience, yet at the same time held bound to personal obedience. Another significant innovation, yet in line with developing tradition, was Dominic's insistence on profession to a prelate rather than to the rule. Dominic adopted the canonical form of the Norbertines, but completed its transition from obedience to the rule to obedience to the living authority of the superior. He dropped any reference to a local church or saint, and the novice professed obedience solely to Dominic and to his successors, incarnated in the person of the immediate religious superior. The superior had the right to grant exemptions to the rule. They were absolved from the least trace of the old stabilitas loci, or stability of place, and were available to be sent and deployed wherever the church or the superior thought it was necessary to send them for the good of souls. These innovations alone are enough to see the administrative genius of Dominic, creatively interacting with the tradition and creating something new in the history of the church, a learned, clerical, and mobile force dedicated to the evangelization of the Christian people and the refutation of heresy. Dominic's order would be one of the most significant achievements of the Central Middle Ages. It was truly radical in its etymological sense, a new growth cemented by deep roots which ran through the whole of the tradition. He achieved signal success when on 21 January 1216 he obtained the bull Gratiarum Omnium. While the first bull Religiosum Vitam can certainly be seen as the official approval of the order, the second was more significant in the long run. For the first time, the Pope addressed the bull Fratribus Sancti Romani Predicatoribus, awarding the men with Dominic's prime title for apostolic activity, preachers. From now on, they would use the title friars preachers, denoting a common brotherhood of clerics who dedicated their life to the zeal for souls. Already the obligations of the canonical life seem to be slipping away. The bull specifically sanctions a life of preaching, that the friars might be the unconquered athletes of Christ, dedicated to spreading the word of God in season and out of season. Later authors report at this point that Dominic had a vision that his order would become worldwide, expanding out from its original territory in southern France to the whole world. What the spirit of this vision indicates is that Dominic certainly no longer thought in limited local terms. He began to make plans to dispatch his men to the four winds. After accomplishing all this in Rome, Dominic was back in Toulouse by Pentecost of 1217. He lost no time celebrating his return with his friars or by trumpeting his achievements at the papal court. To the amazement of his brothers and the discomfiture of his supporters, he announced that he was dispatching them around Europe. There was no hesitation, but a simple decision that Dominic was both fully confident in and in which he brooked no opposition. From the standpoint of his supporters, nothing could have been more foolish. To his brothers, it smacked of folly, sending inexperienced men to places like Paris and Bologna to preach, depriving them of the community life they had so recently been enjoying at St. Romanus. Jordan says, quote, Dominic assembled the brethren and announced that in spite of their small number, his heart's desire was to send them throughout the world, and that they would no longer live together in the present domicile. Although they were all surprised at the announcement of this unexpected plan, because of his evident authority of holiness animated him, they easily agreed to it in the hope that it would result in a good purpose, end quote. One may be permitted to imagine the reaction of the brethren was not as full of concord as Jordan suggests. Dominic knew, though, that while they may have been able to form a model religious community and do good in Toulouse and its neighboring areas, by this time the time had come to the realization that the stable canonical life was not for them. They were preachers, and now they needed to be sent. He and his friars preachers were now officially licensed itinerants, with one mind and heart dedicated to the salvation of souls. The time had come to release the hounds who would set fire to the earth. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes or so for questions. It's the tradition of the forum to offer the first question to a student, if there's one with a question.
Clear as that, huh? Good. What was your favorite picture? It was hard finding urban monks. That's
Okay, I'm happy to open up the, Gary, yeah, please.
I dress like one.
Could you shed any further light on, like,
Yeah, I mean, Ignatius destroys community life. There is no community life for the Jesuits at all. It's a totally new way of doing things within that context. I mean, it's all dedicated to formation with the Jesuits and the will of the superior, and it's a total break with the past. I think Dominic sought a much more balanced model in line with tradition that combined the active and contemplative. The Jesuits presage, and this is something we're going to talk about at dinner tonight, because for the vast majority of Western history, contemplation has been seen as the ideal. But for the last 100, 200 years, almost everyone comes to see now the active life as the ideal, right? If you're not out there, helping the poor and building houses and stuff, that you're not really doing anything in the Christian life. And the Jesuits really presaged that. And so the story of the founding of religious orders in the last 300, 400 years has been dedicated to the active apostolate. And that's a real change in Western history. And I think it has to do with modernity, the coming of modernity as well. It's a big question.
so it's all the intellectual formation. I mean, I would
Mm-hmm.
associate
Yeah.
and apostolic zeal,
Mm-hmm.
evangelism.
Right.
But I guess you quoted Aquinas, this idea of combining, right? Like
Yeah. I mean, they really accept, Dominic really accepts Augustine's vision that, yes, we need an active life, but there's got to be a spiritual source, right? We all plug in our iPhones at night, so it recharges at night, right? Preachers, ministers need some sort of recharge, and that happens in community life at the cloister and the life of prayer. Yeah, yeah. Most people did. They couldn't separate them. It's really, really hard. Well, they didn't try very hard because, like Herbert Grimman said, every single religious movement of the 12th century either turned into a heresy or a religious order, and so that was. There's not really a middle ground that you can say that we can just be good preachers of. All the groups that did convert back to the church, they received intellectual training and ordination, which gave them a title to preach. The heretics did not. And so I don't think anybody successfully founded a simple preaching of repentance. I don't think it's possible, like you say. Really, really small. We're talking under 10. Under 10. And these were not like the great professors that we hear of in the 1220s, like Roland and Minetta and people like that. These were some unlettered people. I mean, he sent people who were very probably illiterate to go preach in Paris, which is astonishing. That's some real confidence right there. Right. Well, first of all, most areas had been evangelized by around 1100. The Baltics are really the last true pagan place in Europe, and people were cut off by the Muslims. Various attempts had been tried, but Muslims at that point were not very open to preachers in their town squares, and so bad, nasty things happened to missionaries that tried to go there. And so there was a certain sense that the gospel had been preached to all the people that it needed to be preached to. And the discoveries of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries start to change that very significantly, and which is why you get a return to this idea of a zeal for souls. But you've got to remember, this has to do with balancing of the contemplative and the active too. In the tradition, the contemplatives are doing just as much, if not more, than the actives. Right? There's a reason why the church sees St. Therese of Lisieux, who lived her entire life in a convent, as the patroness of the missions. Because that's what she did all day, was pray for the missionaries. And if you accept the power and necessity of prayer for the Christian mission and accept the superiority of the contemplative life, then they're doing maybe more than anyone in order to go out and spread the gospel. It's not always, we tend to see this active, right? We've got to do something physical, bodily in order to be a good Christian. Well, you always have to do something bodily, but sometimes that's were you in Dr. Haynes' class today? Anybody see the Integrate Silence? Yeah, I wouldn't see those people as turning their backs on the world. Some people have said that it's only because of places like that divine anger has not been loosed on earth. That was a very common medieval sentiment. That it's only because of the prayers of monks who give up everything that the rest of us haven't been fried yet. Mm-hmm. Right. Not really. Once that happens, Dominic and Francis were very insistent not to accept any episcopal charges to become bishops. That didn't last very long. The Franciscans and Dominicans were too good. They were too closely allied with the papacy for them to avoid promotion for so long. So we start to see them in the 1220s. Within 5 years of Dominic's death, you start to see Dominican bishops. There is not terribly much, because a bishop enters into a new order, actually. So we all know Cardinal O'Malley, right, from Boston. He's Capuchin, is that what he is? He's Capuchin. But he's not anymore. All right, any more than Pope Francis is a Jesuit anymore. Once you enter into the episcopal state, you're not technically subject to the order. You can continue to wear the habit, but it's more of an aspect of devotion. So, for instance, the Pope is not subject to the general of the Jesuit order now, all right, because when you become a bishop, you enter into something totally different. And so there wasn't any conflict in terms of, oh, well, that's a Dominican bishop. Generally, dioceses were quite happy to have mendicant bishops because they knew, first of all, that they were generally independent from local power struggles in the clergy, and that they were upright and we're gonna manage well. The Franciscan Dominican bishops of the first 50, 75 years were very, very good men indeed. No, Father Peter Martyr. I wrote my first book on Peter Martyr, so I have to take a question from Father Peter Martyr.
It's just a follow-up on Dan's question.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to say a few words on?
Yeah, the nuns are the real Dominicans. It's not you guys. They're the original Dominicans. They were there long before you. So that was another one of the symbiotic relationships. I think both Dominic and Jordan, with Diana D'Angelo, and also Peter of Verona recognized this, and Francis certainly recognized it with St. Clare, how necessary it was to have an army of contemplatives behind you. If you didn't have an army of contemplatives behind you, how could you ever accomplish your mission? And it was only later, in the 20 or 30 years later, that there started to be dissension between the male and female branches of the order, which was a highly edifying time in the life of the mendicants. But I think that's what both Dominic and Francis saw, that you've got to have that. Not only does the community life give you a spiritual recharge, but these contemplatives give you a spiritual recharge.
After the order's founding, what would you say are its characteristics
Well, I mean, strengths, clearly it's constitution. It is a constitutionally balanced between aristocracy and democracy. It anticipates any number. I think it would be really interesting to study from a political theory perspective, but nobody's really done that. Its strengths are its liberty. It has a liberty that no order in the church had possessed up to that time in order to follow what it needed to do. Some of the weaknesses were they occurred at a strange time where the identity of the external identity of Christians started to move from orthopraxis. All right, how do you spot a good Catholic? It's a Catholic that does Catholic things. They go to processions, they go to Mass, they go to communion, they do all those things visibly. That was the laity's idea of orthodoxy. The Dominicans brought with them an intellectualized idea that began to fixate increasingly on the internal form, on confession, and on orthodoxy. All right, as opposed right belief as opposed to right action. The laity, they knew how to spot a heretic. It was somebody who didn't do Catholic things. But the Dominicans, in pushing this more intellectualized vision of the faith, begin, and this with Raymond of Peñafort and the idea of the rise of confessional manuals and things like this, they start to engineer a real change that's going to lead to a lot of the tension around institutions like the Inquisition, I think. But it's eventually their vision that's going to succeed going into the Catholic Reform period. I mean, I could say a lot more about it, but I mean. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you hit the nail on the head at the time that the church needed it. The church had been struggling with this reconciliation of active and passive, or orthodoxy, orthopraxis, for 100 years, ever since the time of the Gregorian Reform. And no one had really, not the Cistercians, not the Waldensians, on any side of it had been able to do that. It was Dominic and all of the people that, and I don't want to say, I want to say all the people that came and helped him to found this, that enabled him to discern that charism, to respond to heresy and to respond to the intellectual and educational needs of the Christian people that he did at that time. And I think that was the nexus, that preaching education, the life of the intellect, and allied to a life of virtue. Those are the parts of Dominic's charism that come together and that he bequeaths to the order, I think. Is that sort of what, maybe?
So you mentioned at the beginning the Dominic's devotion to Mary
Mm-hmm.
was.
No. There's some. This is a delicate thing. I probably shouldn't have even mentioned it. But we see Dominicans walking around with their rosaries, right? I mean, the Dominican order is the order of the rosary. Historically, that devotion begins in the 15th century with a man named Saint Dominic of Prussia. He's the first one to introduce the idea of meditating on the mysteries of the rosary. The only thing in the medieval period that would have been similar to that would have been the chaplets of paternosters that was recited by illiterate lay brothers, but never used by the clergy of the order. And so that's what I'm saying is this is the idea that picture of Mary. All these famous pictures of Mary giving the rosary to Dominic obscures the historical, genuine devotion of the Dominican order to Mary. It's not meant to denigrate the rosary in any way, but just to situate it historically better. So the Dominicans were dedicated to Mary from day one, but the rosary is a manifestation of that piety that grew later. Nobody's going to throw any rocks at me.
I'm going to jump back 2 questions. Can you say a little more about
Their constitution is one of the most original documents in constitutional history, I think. And the way that they are able to balance aristocracy and democracy and get good, strong governance in a way that has never really been fundamentally altered for 800 years. People have proposed that this lays the groundwork perhaps for convocation as it's practiced in the English church, and maybe even certain practices that relate to English Parliament itself. So it's worthy of more study, I think, than it's received. But there are so many interesting things about the Dominican constitutions that are really fundamental for later, both in civil and religious society. So I would like to see. You want to write that? You could write that book. That'd be a good book. If anybody's looking for book ideas. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. Well, certainly the first generation of Dominicans was absolutely dedicated to Mary. And I'd like to say something particular about Peter of Verona. Peter of Verona, who had been a former Cathar. Cathars were dualists. They denied the Trinity, but most especially they denied the incarnation of Christ, which meant denying the maternity of Mary. This is not something that they published wildly because people in the Middle Ages, they loved them some Mary. Sorry, I used some Alabama language there. They loved Mary very, very deeply. So this was recognized by the early Dominicans as the Achilles heel to the entire Cathar movement. So they would found confraternities and they would found orders of laity that were dedicated to Marian piety, and they used that as a way to stop the not simply as a tool, but as an overflowing of their own piety as well. Their particular devotion to the hour of Compline is very interesting as well, because the local secular clergy, they controlled lauds and vespers, all right? So people would go for morning prayer and evening prayer at the parish church, so the Dominicans needed to latch on to a different hour. The small hour of Compline, that's the hour that's sung right before bedtime. It's a short, very, very beautiful, but the Dominicans invest this with a special importance, in particular, the solemn singing of the Salve Regina. To which they were exceptionally devoted to. That is from the very first days of the order. The constant insistence that the habit was the result of a vision to Brother Reginald is part of their legend from the very beginning. Whenever they reorient orders, for instance, the Carmelite order by St. Raymond of Peñafort in the 1240s, or the founding of the Servites, aided by St. Peter of Verona, constantly inculcating Marian devotion. And so those are the kind of things that will later manifest themselves, I think, in a full maturity in the idea of the rosary in the 15th century. But very clear from the beginning. But I think it has a lot to do with their relationships with the Cathars at the beginning as well. Yeah. What is somebody said? There's only two things God doesn't know: how many Franciscan orders there are, and what a Jesuit thinks. So, safe space for Dominicans. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot. This is another thing I hope we can talk dinner about, is the balance of the Dominican vows and the emphasis on obedience versus the emphasis on poverty. The emphasis on poverty nearly destroys the Franciscan order in the 13th century, leads it to terrible internal constitutional struggles. Whereas the Dominicans, because of their emphasis on obedience as the chief of the religious vows, never fall into that problem. And also due to the genius of the Dominican constitutions. I mean, it's one of those flexible documents. I mean, imagine a country's constitution lasting for 800 years, right? We're getting pretty good at about 250 here, but call me in another 650 or 5. Sorry, I'm a historian, I do math, and whatever it is, and we'll see how it's going then. But it's the rule of Dominic that makes that, the prudence and the emphasis on obedience, I think. You mean backfilling in the older orders, inspiration? Yes. Yeah, I think you see that in that many preachers start to arise even from the older orders, from the Cistercians and even from the secular clergy. They use the preaching success of the Dominicans as a model, and so you'll see a lot of those. But I mean, of course, the chief is going to be the intellectual work of the order, particularly that of Thomas and the Thomistic tradition, that is going to inform all later orders, including the Jesuit order and and most of the other groups in the church, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the two people went to Paris. Yeah, two people went to Bologna. Yeah, yeah, he just, but then they started preaching, and they started emptying classrooms. I mean, professors and students would go run to the Dominican houses and profess immediately from the, that happens at Providence, I'm sure, regularly. You guys run and demand to be professed as a member of the Dominican order right away. But this is what happened at Bologna. You know, the Bologna thought it was all tough and secular, and then all of a sudden the Dominicans come and they start emptying out the university and start stealing other professors' chairs and stuff like this. And that's, I mean, they're teaching chairs, not their actual chairs. But so that, yeah, yeah. Then they started from, you know, a small group. You know, Francis, as Father Augustine shows, I mean, was much smaller than people commonly. He didn't go to Rome with 12 followers. He probably was there with 2 followers when he visited Innocent III for the first time. So, yeah, you know, a little seed can go a long way. Mm-hmm. Dominic was present for all of it. He certainly didn't fight in it. But there is no indication that Dominic disapproved of it either. Dominic was essentially, his best lay friend was Simon de Montfort, who was the leader of the Albigensian Crusade. Dominic was married, was the officiant at Simon's daughter's marriage. He baptized their children. And so they were very, very good friends. What Dominic didn't like was the disorder that was produced by the crusade that made actual preaching impossible. It made active reconciliation impossible. And that's what another thing Dominic bequeaths to the Inquisition. One of the points of the Inquisition is reintegration and repentance, not punishment. That's one of the things that Dominic wants, and that's what he works for. He doesn't want heretics hurt or punished just because they're heretics. He wants them reintegrated in church society. And so I think that was an effect of the Albigensian Crusade, because a dead heretic means that the Dominicans failed and the Inquisition failed. So they didn't pursue that. Mm-hmm. Well, that went on 2 levels. They preached to the laity, using, and we still have many, we don't have too many examples of preaching from Dominic's own period, but maybe a generation later. And they used normal tactics that people would use in preaching today. They would use similes, they would use metaphors, they would bring things down to people's understanding, they would address them directly, they would talk about virtues and repentance and things like that. And then they would hold disputations on another level in order intellectually to refute the heretics. All right? And so the people would see them having the intellectual skill to defeat the heretical leaders, while at the same time having the skill to personally reach the normal, everyday lay people. Something that aided this a lot was the development of confession and the skill that the friars had with confession. Thank you very much for great questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.